This is Canon Fodder, episode 43, live from the moon. My guest this week is Dexter De La Paz of Timeline Earth fame. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing fantastic. The gravity catapults are fully loaded, and I am ready to finally end the tyranny of Earth.
Yes, and we'll make sure that we have a few rigged elections on the way as well, because that only happens in fiction.
Yes, it's very important to note no one here is an election denier, not even once.
No, never. The freest and the fairest. Babyhead Joe definitely won all those votes all by himself. Anyway, so before we get into the book, I do have to gush a little bit. I'm a big fan of TLE. Anybody who's listening to this who is not a subscriber to Timeline Earth, I highly suggest you do so. They're a very funny news program, very serious at the same time.
So serious, we flip a coin to decide who we're supporting any given week. And without totally ruining our kayfabe, I would just like to go ahead and say that when I'm on the episode with them, I am literally flipping a coin for us. It's totally legit, that part of it.
I mean, that's better than the real news who don't even flip the coin. You know, at least you guys are putting a little bit of honesty in there.
Oh, sure. And, that's one of my highest principles, of course, is honesty.
Gambling.
Well, that too, actually, yes. But honesty in gambling.
Well, and, at least in this case, the house doesn't always win. So that's good. So we're discussing Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. This is actually the third Heinlein book that I'm covering in 43 episodes of doing this show.
So can I just assume that that's his holy trinity you're working your way through? Or did you get into some of the obscure stuff?
So we first did Starship Troopers, which, is like you say is in his holy trinity. And then my friend Cap, who I brought up to you before we started recording, he went with a real deep cut, Farnham's Freehold.
Oh, that one is so good too.
Yes. So that one I couldn't put on YouTube.
No, I can see that. Yeah,
but,
I can imagine another.
So why Paz? Why is Professor Bernardo de la Paz your favorite character? I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I heard you on Jay Burden's podcast where you mentioned that he was the inspiration for your online persona, at least in name. And that was the reason why I reached out to have you on and talk about this book. So feel free to expand on that.
So, for those of you who have not read this book yet, first of all, shame on you. It's a masterpiece. But his character sketch in brief is he is an idealistic former professor ? It's a little unclear just what he actually is a lot of the time, beyond being a thought criminal. And that's the whole reason he's out in the moon in the first place, is because he thinks a little too freely, more often than he should.
He's a little communist-y, if I'm being less than generous.
Yeah, there's whiffs of that, and that's actually something about Heinlein in particular we could talk about later. But for now, the character sketch on Mr. Bernardo is his whole deal is he's very idealistic, he's very free thinking. He's not a dude who's going to let other people rule him. But at the same time, as idealistic as he is, he's extremely realist. And you see this especially through the second half of the book, or the middle through the end. And his whole deal is he essentially socially engineers a second American style revolution from the moon. Not entirely just to spite Earth, but out of a sincere desire to advance human freedom. And he does this through means that are certainly not ideologically pure for the libertarians and the anarchists, who frequently count Heinlein among their ranks, and I think rightfully on a character analysis of the author himself. So
Oh,
you
he
guy
loved.
who's getting his hands dirty in some very questionable ways without ever losing sight of the goal and without actually compromising those values he's talking about. Is that spoiler free enough character sketch?
Yes, and don't worry about spoilers. I've beaten my audience with spoiler warnings enough in that we don't do spoiler warnings. So feel free to speak as freely about the book as you want. Uh, I'm expecting. I've trained my audience to this point. I think to not expect kid gloves. Uh,
Fair enough. So, in your opinion, is there anything big I missed? Because I think those are really the key points about him. There's a lot of other stuff, but those are the main themes with him, in my
well,
opinion.
well, I'd say that Prof is. Uh, I would touch more on the fact that he is a complete realist, especially at the first meeting. He is very concerned about the dwindling resources on Luna, right? So his at least his initial call to action is one of necessity because they just cannot continue to ship their resources to Earth without suffering a drastic uh, consequence.
Yeah, yeah, and again, that's the whole thing. I found very compelling the dualism because, like I said, he seems to me to be entirely ideologically motivated. It's not just that he's preaching these things; he's only going through all these steps because he actually believes them. But at the same time, as you said, his motivation to begin doing so was more or less a resource crisis, and it extends beyond just physical resources too, right? He's seeking out sovereignty because it's necessary, not just because it's his ideology, but because they must have it or they will no longer exist further.
Now, I don't talk to many libertarians, but I can't imagine that he's well liked in their circles only because he does things.
Well, so the only problem with that is even just a thought like that is indicative of a very recent cultural shift in the zeitgeist. Because Heinlein himself was a founding member of the American Libertarian Party and one of their
Mm.
most ardent supporters through the early years. And he remained very, very well liked by them until they started to see the sharp leftward pivot of the Libertarian Party. And even now, there's holdouts that still rightfully regard him in very high regard, despite the fact that he is generally considered more of a right winger than a libertarian today, which is also odd, and I think due to the cultural influence of Starship Troopers among his works.
Mm.
Despite the fact that if you really examine his full body of work, what it ends up looking like is he is genuinely a libertarian with this social liberalism that comes with that, but it was the social liberalism of a different era, and there was a sort of muscularity to his insistence on his own rights and the rights of others that does not fit well with modern leftism. So I think he is certainly not a leftist, but I also think it would be very incorrect to call Heinlein properly a creature of the right because he just wasn't. People
He was a
talk
little too
about their
sexually loose to be a right winger, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, and there's assumptions made about that based on some of his personal connections and certainly based on some of his writings. How far that ever went in actuality, I think is actually probably a matter for debate. There was certainly some experimentalism of it. Again, within the context of the culture he was living in, nothing so insanely debauched as we see today in our culture.
Right.
But yeah, there was certainly some of that, and you clearly see and understand personally what I'm gesturing at.
Yeah.
So he might be like the one true libertarian to have ever existed because he certainly wasn't a leftist, but by no modern or historical reading is he properly a right winger either.
Now, only in 2024 could he be considered a right winger. That's well put.
Yeah, and many, many such cases too, when you stop and think about it, actually.
Yeah, one of them's running for president.
Absolutely, no question there.
Anywho, so to kind of get back to the beginning of the book, right? Because we did steep ourselves a little bit in there talking about Prof. Starts out, we're kind of introduced to life on the moon. We're introduced to Manny, who is kind of a hodgepodge of different ethnicities. He's missing an arm that's replaced by a robotic tool that allows him to work on the moon's computer system. It starts acting up because it has gained sentience, and they become friends. He names the computer Mike after Mycroft Holmes because the computer system is called Holmes 4. And through this, the plan to liberate Luna from Earth is all planned through Mike. Do I have that more or less?
Yeah. The professor, who is my digital namesake, is certainly the beating heart of it, and perhaps the guiding mastermind from a theory standpoint. But all the functional planning is definitely run through basically red pilling this AI, essentially. Using our modern parlance, obviously, that's not necessarily the way the story reads, but in function and in a way the audience would understand, they kick off a revolution by red pilling an AI.
Hopefully, many such cases will occur. I don't know. People as of today, people are really playing around with Grok, and
look at that word grok, huh? Where else have we heard that?
that's true. I haven't covered Stranger in a Strange Land yet, but that should definitely be the fourth Heinlein to cover.
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on that one myself, and I think it gets a bad rap among people like us due to its surface level theme. People need to examine that one a little deeper than they typically do.
I've actually not read that one yet, so I'll tell you what, I'll read it and then I'll have you back and we can talk about it.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan to me. This guy is my favorite author by quite a wide margin. I could talk about him endlessly, I'm sure.
I'll have to introduce you to my friend Cap. He feels the same way.
So, getting back to where you were at, you've got Manny, who is somewhere between a mechanic, a handyman, and a hyper advanced software engineer. Because that, I'm going to go ahead and stop talking about the book and talk about Heinlein again.
Yeah,
So, one of the reasons that Manny is the character that he is, and the professor is the way that he is, and the fact that he's using an all knowing AI as a character at all, is because Heinlein had this deal. One of his core beliefs, and one of the things that he just insists on in so many of his characters, unless the character is intentionally a one trick pony to highlight this other theme, then all of his characters will have a core theme of competency.
Mm-hmm.
His characters can do a little bit of anything, they can do it well, and they just take it for granted because it's so important. And he's using their taking it for granted to make a very important point to his audience that it's so important to have an active, well-rounded skill set.
And we also have to look at the context around when this book is written. America is almost at the moon at this point. The Cold War is kicked off. Hyper competence is the I'd say the winning edge or the bleeding edge of the Cold War, right?
Yeah, America is at the height of its technical powers. When he's active and when he's writing, it's often also called the golden age of sci-fi for much of the same reason. And you're living in a time when everyday man can just go out and build a car. Hot rodding was also huge in this time frame.
Right.
And you could work on your own home electronics. You could study and improve them because the technologies within them weren't so esoteric and weren't so protected from a trade copyright standpoint that they were totally opaque. You could go and you could learn to build, and then you could build, and from building you could create these marvels. And so in that sense he was very much a man of his time, but not just a man of his time. He was an archetype of this sort of thing that was just also happening in American culture. And I think that's part of the reason he caught on like he did. And our understanding that as a cultural touchstone for Americanism, I think, is one of the reasons his work has hung around as well as it has and remained so well loved.
Right. Definitely. And I would wholeheartedly agree. Of the Golden Age sci-fi writers, he is my favorite as well. I don't. Yeah, Vonnegut would probably be considered that generation as well, but I kind of keep him to the side because he's different.
Yeah, he's his own cat. You can't really typify him in any way, let alone that way. I do enjoy some of his work more than others. He's just not quite my cup of tea.
Yeah, and Asimov, he's just excuse me, he's kind of inhuman, and Philip K. Dick is. I would say that Philip K. Dick and Heinlein both suffer from both have similar structures as writers. Really interesting ideas, some unfortunately flat characters.
Yeah, and I think there might be something to that. My fanboyism will force me to publicly deny it here on your show, but if you asked me after recording if I agreed with that statement, I would probably be forced to. So let this be a public repudiation with a wink at you through
Got
the
it.
cameras we have turned off.
Right. Well, I mean, you're sitting here on the couch.
Yes,
And
that's right. I'm actually physically present in the room. There's one microphone between us.
well, of course. I mean, I couldn't imagine doing a podcast any other way. That seems scary and inhuman and magical.
Lacking the personal touch.
Right. Well, we're all about the personal touch here.
So, yeah, the characters, and maybe this is just a result of his IQ being a little too high, Heinlein himself being a little too competent, a little too masculine, and a little too far on the spectrum. He seems to have a hard time modeling actual human behavior.
Mm.
And as a result, he writes his characters more as springboards for traits to explore than actual people. And I would say that in writing in general, this is actually just something that's also evolved over time. You'll find that in a lot of older writing, this is just how characters were too. So it's not necessarily just him that's like this, so much as it is just a consequence of modern storytelling. A lot of more recent writers are more concerned with character drama and character development than they are with telling an actual story.
Mm.
What's going on in a character's head is not the end all be all of a story. I want to hear about the dragon getting slayed, not your love triangle trepidations while you're riding your horse to slay the dragon.
I wonder how much of that is actually a consequence of America. It's of being American itself. What you bring up a good point. I think that's more so a problem in genre fiction, whether it's horror, science fiction, even detective stories. But certainly the young adult schlock that we see today, like my wife has read a couple of really, really horrible books by women, but I repeat myself. And yeah, it's all love triangle bullshit. And I also read either in translation or books from England from the previous 2 centuries, and it's not as much a problem there. So I wonder
Yeah,
how much of it is Americans just wanting to get to the action, or then
I
trying
I
to get away from that.
I really don't think it's a question of Americanism. It is something peculiar to our modern culture, but I don't think it has anything to do with American culture. I think it's got more to do with being symptomatic of the culture war.
Mm,
I think it has more to do with neurotic leftism being the dominant force behind all traditional publishing and a lot of independent publishing at this point. And so they love nothing more than to feed their neuroses and play with their egos more than anything. They can't imagine anything more important than a poorly written romance story. And so that's what all of their stories, period, turn into.
no, that's fair enough, and that's I'd co-sign that. Yeah.
Or
So
maybe I'm entirely full of shit. It's
no,
hard to
no, no,
say.
don't. I think you're right there. So
Well,
don't.
I just want to leave your audience room to disagree with me.
Oh,
I'll never
they'll let you
claim to.
know.
Oh, I hope they do. Please at me on Twitter. It is still called Twitter. There's no such thing as X.
Nothing ever happens, and definitely not any name changes. So the I guess triumvirate of humans plus Mike, because there's also the woman character. They begin their, which I mean, Wyoming not. Uh, she's just kind of there, and I think she kind of represents the naive idealist.
Yes, yeah.
She
She is the revolutionary to well, Bernardo's a revolutionary too, but there's a word I'm fishing for here. You know that famous painting of the storming of the Bastille where the
mhm,
woman's waving the flag?
right,
That is very much her. And Bernardo is the member of the revolutionary councils in the background, whipping up the crowd to go and storm them in the first place.
right, right. He's more of the shadowy cabal figure,
He very much so is, yes.
and the hyper competent uh, chess player, whereas she's more of a pawn, a beloved pawn, but a pawn all the same.
Yeah, and at this point, I think it's important just to step in and say, perhaps this is just me being that feeling when no about her, but I think there's a little bit of a bad connotation to naive
Mm,
because she is certainly idealistic, but true to Heinlein's other female characters, she is actually quite competent in her own right.
right, right. She's also the love interest, right?
Yes,
One of the
yeah.
things about Heinlein books is that there has to be sort of the young, sexy love interest that the not Heinlein protagonist gets with.
Yeah.
He's
Yep.
the man had the man enjoyed himself some young strange.
Which, again, cultural norms, it's okay to like hot women. I think it's safe to say that
Whoa, whoa,
much.
whoa, whoa!
Like, it's all right to have the action hero want to get with the sexy female lead that you set up for that exact purpose.
I don't know, man. We better be. I better
Censor
take
all
that
that
out.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So they create the primary cell of resistance fighters, and I learned more about insurgency from this book than a lot of books that I've read on like counterinsurgency and strategy and stuff like that. The way that Heinlein creates the cells using alphabetical letters and then branching out from there, I thought was brilliant. And I don't know if that was his own idea or if it's something that he picked up, but that's one of the. There are many ideas in this book. This is probably the most applicable one for any you dissidents out there, let's say.
Yeah. So, Heinlein and insurgencies, right? So some people may or may not know about this about him. He was a Navy veteran in his own right. You don't really associate the Navy with insurgencies, but he was fundamentally a military man, and that
Hmm.
does come through in his writings. It's clear to me, most primarily, that he's a very thoughtful writer and he understood himself to be in an intellectual minority. I think that is also very clear given how many of his characters are the way that they are. It's clear from interviews, written interviews, radio interviews with him from his own time, that he understood that he was living in a period of American history where there was a risk of censorship if he didn't write carefully, and that even when he was writing these more robust adult focused novels, he needed to keep himself in check a little bit also to maintain audience size. You know, his most well loved works are usually considered young adult novels in the sense of what a young adult novel should be as
Mm.
opposed to what they are today. So you see a lot of stuff like this where he's winking and nodding at ideas, not necessarily writing them as though they're nonfiction theory work. So you see him doing stuff just like this. Well, how do you organize small groups? How do you organize a movement? How do you conceal yourself in plain sight if you need to? And you see all of this stuff coming through in fiction work because he's a fiction writer, and you see it coming through in these sorts of winks and nods and these ideas and, oh well, this is how these fictional characters would do it, but oh my, there's certainly no way you could do that in real life, right? Right? Wink nod sort of thing.
Definitely. And it's to go back to the competence, uh, the hyper competence of his characters for a second. You're completely right that he takes for granted that these people have to be the way that he is, right? He can't. In some ways, I've heard it said that you can't write people that are smarter than you. Well, it's also really difficult to write people who are dumber than you, and I think Heinlein typifies that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, even the opposition to his characters are typically very capable individuals. There's very rarely do you see a Heinlein character of any alignment where they're just a blabbering buffoon moron. It just doesn't really happen for him. And that might too also get to what you're saying about him also writing flat characters. You know, it might not
Mm.
just be an inability so much as he doesn't know how to write anything else.
No, and that's a good point. Even guys like the warden or the leaders on Earth that Manny ends up meeting later in the story. Yes, they're competent, they're serious, which we don't see anymore, and they're acting within their own interests, right? I think actually the most interesting character of the whole book is Stu, because he's just kind of doing it for laughs. He's having fun with everything. You know, he's not so serious, though still competent.
Yeah, yeah, and for him, it's not necessarily a prank, not necessarily an intellectual exercise, but somewhere in that milieu, on a spectrum between doing it just because he can and because he's interested to see how it would work.
Yes, he's a future Faustian man. It's there, so he has to do it. There's another fun part later on in the book, not much later on, where they're finally organizing, and Prof creates the Lunar Congress, right?
Yes.
Where everybody gets to have their say, and it's just endless navel gazing debate, and he's letting them sort of spin their gears because he knows that it's just going to be the cabal that he has set up that's going to be making everything run the way that he wants it to.
And that's genuinely my favorite part of the book,
Yes,
is that
yes.
little congress of theirs. And it's from that brilliant performance behind the scenes of his that I chose to draw my pseudonym.
Mm-hmm.
I am not so full of myself as to think I would be capable of something like that or even necessarily want to. But the first time I read this book, I must have been 14. I was an actual young adult, the intended audience of this book. And I was just so breathtaking with it. And I was so impressed. It just left a very lasting impression on me. I've since read this book again 4 or 5 times since, probably. And it is still my favorite, very, very favorite part of the book. It's a masterpiece, really. And if anyone in the audience has pretensions about organizing, about power and institutions, and how to effectively exert influence, Heinlein, as he is with every subject he touches, is actually a masterclass. You can learn far more from fiction than you ever will from theory cell nonfiction.
Yes, yes. And I wanted to make that point as well, because you're completely right. I completely agree. It's the fiction. It's very difficult for me to grasp political theory in the abstract. Maybe I'm being filtered. Maybe it's an IQ thing, but seeing it played out in simulation through fiction, right? And it's not the only reason that one should read fiction. I think that it helps develop a more rich inner life uh, generally. But seeing ideas play out in a sort of lab setting uh, is a lot. It's a lot easier to grasp than just reading. Mencius Bug or geez, I don't even name insert elite theorist here. Right?
Yeah, well, the one everyone's been jacking off in recent years is Burnham.
Right, Burnham
And,
or
to be fair to Burnham, his work is actually phenomenal, but like, come on, give the theory a break. It's boring.
right, and I've got several elite theorist books that are just crisp sitting on my shelf that I have never opened. I've got both of Juvenile's books, and I doubt that I'll be popping them open anytime soon. But yeah, it's if you want to really understand elite theory, read "The Moon Is a Harsh Mistress."
Yes, yes, yes. And I would say in general, you should give yourself a little bit more credit. I don't think it's a matter of getting filtered, because I would say that reading fiction and being able to enjoy fiction is the ultimate exercise in shape rotation, whereas theory crafting and nonfiction could never be anything other than base word celery.
Total word cell death.
Well, I'm
We're
not going to go that far. I've
we're
got word cell mutuals. So.
we are a shape rotator podcast. You pick a side.
But yeah, fiction, enjoying fiction is ultimately an exercise in the pinnacle of shape rotation, because it forces you to visualize and interact with whole worlds, fully shaped environments. That's more than just turning an apple in your head or seeing if you can picture a cow tap dancing or whatever the standard litmus test is for shape rotation.
So there's probably one more famous idea that comes from this, but well, two more, but one of them's a phrase and the other's an idea that I'd be remiss if we didn't go over is the line marriage, right? The solution to a polygamist or to the problem of polygamy in a place where there are many more men than women without degenerating into a longhouse matriarchy.
Yeah,
Because they
and
still have balls at this time.
this is one of those things. I knew we were going to bring it up eventually, and I was trying to prepare myself, and I just don't know what to do with it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how
because
I feel.
this is one of those things where I just can't necessarily defend him on the grounds on the face of it because it's just weird.
Hmm.
The best defense of it is that it is probably a very natural sociological evolution for the theory environment that he created. And so, in that case, you could just dismiss it as he's run the permutations and this is how it would work in that society. The moon is a prison colony. Of course, prisons are going to be predominantly men, but you're writing a piece of fiction. You could have gender balanced it if you wanted to, and he would have been smart enough to do so had he chosen to. And so it comes back to what point is he trying to make here? And then that's where his own personal proclivities show up. And you have to wonder, well, is there some influence of that on this? And given the things that he is said to have enjoyed and probably did enjoy, even those tastes aren't necessarily compatible with what's being presented here.
I'll defend it a little bit because I think he wrote himself not into a corner, but he wrote about a prison break that doesn't move in space, but it's I guess you could call it a political prison break, right? And the one thing that about Heinlein is that he sticks to his guns. He does not he does not shy away from the natural consequences of the stories that he builds up. I'm thinking especially of Farnham's Freehold, where there's the scene with his daughter who, there's only 4 people left on Earth. She's definitely not going to sleep with her brother. She's definitely not going to sleep with the black guy. Oh, she'll procreate with her own father. That sounds good to her. And you as the reader, you're like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. It's disgusting, but
Well, and so that, to your point, that is exactly what you have to decide about Heinlein himself and choose where you come down on his works. Is this him basically projecting something, which I don't think is the case and don't want to be the case
mhm.
either? So perhaps in that my judgment is compromised. Or is it, as I prefer to think, this is just, as you said, the natural consequences of the thought experiment as it has been set up? What other option is available without hand waving?
Yeah, I think to psychologize is kind of fake and gay, honestly.
It's a fool's errand.
Especially just the over amount of psychologizing we have in our culture these days. I think that we shouldn't fall into that trap. We should give this brilliant man his due. Definitely don't have to agree with his life decisions, but as far as a man who creates thought experiments, that's that's where we should land on it. Feel free to disagree, dear listener, but that's where Paz and I'll stake our claim.
And the important thing, just for the context of this book, is that something you also brought up, but I want to hammer back home again. His conception, his system of line marriages is not some. It's not some longhouse nonsense. It's not reverse harem fiction for women's romance. It's actually just more akin to matrilineal uh, heritage tracing, but taken to the logical extreme, almost more than anything. It's using the few women around as touchstones for social organization without ceding them necessarily political power, more cultural influence.
Right, because there is the main wife of the Davis family, and she kind of has over a larger say on what goes on in the household, which I think that that's proper, that a woman should have a large amount of say what happens inside her home, right? And again, this is uh, the natural consequence of, well, what if no bitches?
Right.
You know,
Right.
and again, it's not overdone. I think it's certainly not something that could happen naturally. It would have to be set up, and competent people would have to set it up. Otherwise, we get something that, we get polycules, which are the longhouse version of this setup, right?
Yeah, and that's a very, really, really good way to put it, because these are not polycules. They are, I want to try and say this is even brought up in the book. This is the natural consequence of when there's just not enough women,
Mm-hmm.
but the men are all dangerous enough that it would be a disaster to fight over them.
Right. And then also, it's a good way to keep track of families so that uh, the consequences of incest on the population do not affect the competence of the people living on the moon.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I am glad I didn't have to go out on a limb to say that this is probably just the natural consequence of
Mm-hmm.
the environment he set up for us. I'm glad other well read individuals are reaching that conclusion.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And again, I mean, is it weird? Yeah, but he's a weird guy. This is not the most out there crap that he's put out onto paper.
no,
Uh,
not even a little.
yeah.
And so I suppose I'll just throw it out there so that listeners understand what we're talking about when we dance around him as an individual a little bit. There is a lot of evidence from the people he ran around with socially and subtle clues in a lot of his books that he probably was a part of the very famous and infamous California swinger scene.
Mm.
And, maybe some other stuff too, but definitely just that sort of swinging, wife sharing
Yeah,
lifestyle.
there's a couple of little Heinleins running out there that don't know it.
Yes, yeah. And I would also just emphasize, though, that he is the reason he's a right wing icon these days is because A, people don't know that about his background, and B, he is more masculine than any of us could have ever hoped to be.
Right. Have you seen the show The Venture Brothers?
I've seen bits and pieces of it here and there, yeah.
It's a terrific show. Highly recommend, especially if you're a fan of science fiction, because it does a lot of really great homage and taking the piss out of sci-fi concepts. Only reason I bring it up, besides the fact that it's one of my favorite shows, is there is the character of Dr. Venture, who is the now deceased father of the main character, who is based very much on like a Doc Savage sort of Benton Quest kind of adventurer, right? And although he's in a lot of ways very irredeemable as a character, because they kind of twist that uh, they twist that trope and put it on its head. He's so masculine that he just has to bed every woman around. Very, very James Bond-esque, right? You wouldn't people would still consider James Bond a right wing masculine icon today, even though he's not wifing someone up and living on a trad farm.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this goes back to the whole thing about Heinlein being a libertarian as he understood himself, and frankly, actually an anarchist by a lot of definitions today. His one of his guiding principles was certainly personal freedom.
Mm,
And he understood that at such an autistic intellectual level that I don't think he could comprehend the idea of running his woman's life for her. And I think that might be where a little bit of this part of it we're discussing right now
yeah.
comes from. Like, hey, she wants to do that. Okay, good luck to her. I know where she's going to be later.
I think he also probably logicked his way to some of the conclusions. He's like, oh, I have this sex drive. I want to bed every good looking woman I see. Therefore, if I can do it, I should do it.
Yeah,
There's
and
a
there's some of that. I guess I don't know too much about his moral philosophy as divorced from political philosophy. So I guess I
and
don't know where he landed on a lot of those things from an ethical perspective. I just understand how his politics was derived from it.
and to be fair, neither do I.
Well, and I don't think anyone does because a lot of that stuff just didn't enter the calculus for him.
Right.
That goes back to him being one of the arch autists of American history. You don't know what he was feeling because he was too busy explaining in detail through fiction what he was thinking to talk about his feeling.
All right. All right. I have to ask. What is the Mount Rushmore of American autists? Let's say it's Heinlein. I think you could put Stonewall Jackson up there.
Yep,
Who else?
Jackson, Heinlein. Gosh, so to get a Rushmore, we need two more, and
Mm-hmm.
that's actually a very good question. I'll pick one from the same era as Heinlein, but a radically different environment. Alan Dulles, second
Yeah.
director of the CIA, arch boogeyman of American intelligentsia. There is every reason to believe that he was both very spectrumy and also extremely psychopathic.
Mm.
So I think that makes him a very good fit for the Rushmore.
And let's put a contemporary autist on there. How about Elon Musk? Even though he
E-
wasn't born here, his love of rocketry just
yeah,
I think
I think it'd be safe to put Elon on the list,
he'll be the
if
black
only
sheep.
because we must take a
A fourth.
contemporary. Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go, folks. That's the official Mount Rushmore of American autism. And I guess John Cena too. Just because. There's one more concept. Again, more of a phrase, but TAANSAAFL. It. I used to be a libertarian, so I got a lot of crap in the mail from them, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of their letterheads would have "there ain't no such thing as a free lunch" on there, which is what the acronym TAANSAAFL stands for. I actually think I think Heinlein does himself a bit of a disservice. He's trying to create a bumper sticker for his ideology or for his belief system.
This might be the single most ham-handed attempt at direct preaching he does in any of his writing anywhere.
And to be fair, it's a lot better than some other people's.
Oh, infinitely, yeah.
But yes, it is.
It
It
comes off as marketing because it's his one and only stab at it, and you can tell.
Yeah. There's a reason he didn't win his Congress seat. People didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
So there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Basically, take every dumb libertarian argument you've ever heard, find out what the smart version of it is, and then try to put a catchy slogan on it. That's what we're talking about.
Right. Who's gonna
There ain't
pay for it? Or
right. That's exactly what it is. It's like it's a tax protest.
Thomas Sowell has that other line where he's like, "There's no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs."
Yeah, and
And
it's that same sort of deal, right?
yes,
It's a political form of grappling with the fact that things must be exchanged and you can't have it both ways.
yeah. So, uh, ham-handed, definitely. I think it gets the message across, and like all things, the people who latched onto it just ruined it for me.
And that's another thing. We've both said it a few times now. Many such cases, right?
Yes, I've never watched Doctor Who, and I never will because I've met people who like it.
Yeah, I am honest enough with the people around me to admit that when I was 11, 12 years old, I really liked Harry Potter.
Mm.
The
Uh-oh.
idea of picking it up now makes me sick.
Yes. Yes. Harold Bloom stays winning.
So, it's that same sort of deal where I genuinely think Heinlein was on something with basically everything he ever said and did.
Mhm.
And there's just also a lot of times where you'll hear people talking about him or people talking about another person and they just don't get it. They ruin it. Um, I'd never call myself an elitist, but I certainly have those thoughts and those impulses, especially when someone's tickling one of my special interests.
Sir, you read for fun. You are definitely an elitist.
Yeah, there's that to consider too.
My good friend Paul Fahrenheit, on the episode that I had him on, he talked about how podcasts like this are the swan song of literacy, or mass literacy rather, which, he's not wrong, but kind of a downer. Let's see. There's the American Revolution aspect of the book, right? The loonies, which is what the lunar colony calls themselves. They beat back their security guards because they are prisoners on the moon. Then they start launching basically asteroids, constructed asteroids at Earth with this giant catapult that they built to ship grain back to Earth, right? Because they were originally just chattel slaves to farm extra food for Earth, and
Yeah.
instead they're sending what is essentially nuclear bombs. Another favorite part of the book for me is they send the coordinates of where the first few uh, asteroids are going to land. They intentionally pick desert areas, places where nobody is,
Out over the sea, I think, for
yeah,
one of them.
just to prove that they can do it with minimal casualties. And the retards on Earth just have to go see. I complained that he didn't understand people very well before, but damn if that is not the most, like,
He
I
nailed
understand
it in that
retards do.
instance. He
Yeah.
absolutely did.
What is the stupidest thing someone can do? And then,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, they're going to drop a giant rock on this spot. I better go stand
Oh,
underneath it.
yeah. Uh, no, that's the phony Yammerhead Congress is your favorite part. The the retards winning the Darwin Awards is my favorite part.
And, what's interesting too is the aftermath of that, because I believe it's either immediately after or shortly after that, where the professor and Manny have to go to Earth to begin to negotiate.
Hmm.
Because it's at that point the Earth leaders realize, oh, they were serious and they really can do this. And we can fire back at them, but not nearly as effectively, because while we're smart, everyone around us are dumbasses. How can we outshoot the supercomputer on the moon? Which is a little bit of a plot hole, actually, when you think about it, but you can grant it because it's a work of fiction.
Well,
So,
I mean, they kind of explain it because nobody knows Mike exists, or
yes,
nobody
yeah.
knows that he is sentient.
And that's the crux of it, is the sentience, because I don't think it's really stated, but it's kind of implied that there's at least near peer stuff on the Earth, or things they can do. It's not as if they don't have the technology to calculate with a computer ballistic firing solutions. They've just got nothing like Mike.
Right. And yeah, I love Mike. And I think we're going to talk about the ending because, I mean, the fight is the fight, right? They gain independence. Uh, there are some casualties on both sides, mostly on Earth's side. Earth finally just acquiesces. They're like, yeah, all right, fuck it, whatever. You guys can be free. One of Mike's, or not Mike's, one of Manny's wives dies, along with a few others, but it's basically the cabal wins and they maintain power, but Mike dies, or he goes offline and he reboots, and Mike is no longer there. It is just the Holmes computer program that was running fine before, until something happens and just suddenly life appears, right? The computer was so advanced that consciousness and sentience was a bug that a reboot fixed.
And there's something crazy in just that idea,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's poignant, it's sad, and you really feel for it because Mike is portrayed as a genuine character. If you let yourself forget that he's a mainframe, you would think that he's a person too, to the extent that any of Heinlein's characters can be called people. Again, with the whole cutouts thing. But then to lose him, it it gets you in your feelings, I guess is
Right.
what I'm saying.
Yes. There's, and I mean, Professor Paz dies as well. He has a heart attack. Like, he very much almost William Wallace esque at the end of Braveheart, where like he proclaims freedom and then he just kind of passes away. Um, but that's almost earned, and you're like, oh, he was an old man, he was sick. The
Yeah,
trip to
and one
Earth really took a lot out of him.
and that it's all extremely reasonable, right? He'd been
Hmm.
up on a moon prison colony for forever. He's already established to be the wizened and wise elder statesman. And he kind of knows it's going to be his only trip down to help with the negotiations, anyways.
Yeah, and Manny, of course, he is, because he's super competent, because he outplanned the whole thing. He is then foisted into a position of leadership, which he's not exactly thrilled about. But hey, he'll do it because
A man
nobody else
has to
can.
do a man's work, right?
Right, right. But at the last line of the book, even though he keeps working on the mainframe, hoping that Mike comes back, he asks, Bog, is a computer one of your creatures? And that floored me. It's it, damn, I have so many favorite parts. This is my favorite part. Fuck it.
Yeah, I mean it's just such a beautiful work. We could sit here for another 3 hours and just gush and squee like little girls about how wonderful it is.
Mhm.
But that'd be a waste of both of our times, first of all.
And I
But
don't
it
think the listeners would get it after about 10 seconds.
but it's a masterpiece. Despite flat characters, despite being very spectrumy as a thing to read and an author to read, for people who are also that way, this stuff just hits just right. There's a reason it's a classic.
There's one more thing I want to bring up before we kind of close out. It's interesting to me that Heinlein assumes that in the future the Soviet Union is still there. It's still a country, and uh, it the thing on your guys' show is that nothing ever happens, right? But the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, right, really was a happening. I'm too young to remember it or to have experienced it, but the idea, at least in the 60s when Heinlein's writing this, that the Soviet Union would just cease to exist one day, didn't even cross his vast mind.
Yeah, and despite being the way that he is about so many things, and if you look at his track record from the books and just when they were written versus just when some given things were invented, he is a eerily accurate predictor of where technology will go and
Mm,
something of a hardware prophet. But the fact that this was just out of reach for him in terms of prediction seems like an incongruity to me. And for that reason, I have to almost want to think it's a conscious choice to leave them intact. And if that's the case, then one has to wonder why. Is it to create a more vivid Earth to oppose the moon colony? Um, what do you do with that? I guess I don't know. It's something to muse on, but it is interesting. It would
Yeah,
be just as easy to predict the collapse as to not predict it. So, what is there to gain either way in the story?
yeah, yeah. I don't know. I only brought it up because I found it interesting, and maybe you're right. Maybe he did have inklings of that occurring. But especially, I mean, during the space race, during the golden age of science fiction, really tough to think that the Soviet Union could collapse so relatively quickly. But then I'm sure he couldn't have possibly predicted the current collapse we are sort of listing through as we speak.
Yeah, Heinlein certainly didn't, at any rate.
So, Mr. Paz, where can people find you? How can they support your work? What do you got on the coming down the pipe?
So, the easiest place to access me and my various deranged musings is through Twitter, not X, but Twitter, at TLE PAZ. That's TLE Paz. I am a member of the Timeline Earth podcast organization. I have my own show in addition to the mainline show. It releases under their feed and under their masthead. It is the Scarlet Thread Society. I am a specialist in the paranormal, political conspiracy, and the parapolitical. I have done such things or such works as Were the Knights Templar, the origins of the concept of the military industrial complex. I have done Whether a Christian can in good faith practice tarot, all sorts of weird esoterica.
And all that's behind the paywall, right?
Oh no, that's all freely available on the Timeline Earth feed. Just look
Oh,
for
wonderful.
episodes that are listed as STS.
Oh, damn. I'm gonna have to. I'm That's so up my alley. You don't even know. So
So
I'm gonna binge your stuff. Uh, Dear listener, you should as well.
I've
Uh,
got a couple more shills here to tack on if I can,
please
real
go
quick.
ahead.
You can support the podcast through Patreon, Timeline Earth, or you can support me directly as an individual host through the Scarlet Thread Society Book Club, which is something I just started in July. You pay me $3, and at the end of every month, we talk about a book. For August, that book is Our Haunted Planet by John Keel.
Very cool. And
Now,
I'll make sure to have all of those links below.
yep, I got two more. Please bear with
Oh,
me.
sorry. I keep
No,
thinking you're done. No, but
nope.
please, take as much time as you want.
These last two I brought as a special gift for your audience, knowing the kind of show you do and things they might like. Check out the Art of Darkness podcast as well. They do a similar vein sort of thing here. It's literature review, but with a specialization in sort of the dark and creepy. So there's less overlap in that sense. And finally, if you have read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, or are curious about this sort of thinking from a more explicitly right wing perspective, check out the Powers of Earth series by Travis Cochran.
Very cool. I will link all those below. I actually had Kevin Kautzman on as one of my guests.
You've had him already.
Oh yeah, no, good friend of the
Oh, I
show.
absolutely love that dude.
Oh yeah, no, him and Brad. I have to have Brad on. But yeah, I'm in their TG group. I talk to them all the time, and they're good friends and very gracious to my constant shilling in their pool.
Okay, well, in that case, the audience already knows Art of Darkness.
Yes, they are the best, and I try to do my best to not step on their toes when I discuss books because I really do appreciate what they do and how they do it. So as for the Double Dealer, you guys know at this point, I've written books. We have a couple magazines out. If you want to support me, you go buy a book. If you want to support the show, you can become a paid subscriber over on Substack. You can buy a magazine out, issue 13. Still the best issue that we've put out to date. Really terrific stuff. the more that you guys buy, the more that we can support writers and artists in our sphere. Yeah, like, share, subscribe. We're putting it on YouTube. We're putting it on all your favorite podcasting platforms, Spotify as well. I don't know how to end podcasts, so I'll just say insert ending here.